human pilot crashes into forbidden forest and finds a lonely goddess. The atmosphere of Xylos did not scream. It howled like a wounded beast as the Vanguard 7 tore through the ionosphere. Caspian gripped the vibrating flight controls, his knuckles white against the dark leather of his gloves. The heat shielding was failing, a dull red glow creeping across the cockpit glass. He did not pray, because humans like him trusted in physics and grit rather than gods. The forbidden forest loomed below, a vast sea of violet and emerald flora that the charts warned was a graveyard for any craft foolish enough to enter its airspace. He fought the drag, his muscles burning as he forced the ship into a controlled glide. The impact was a symphony of snapping timber and screeching metal. "Stay with me," he muttered to the dying AI in his helmet. The silence that followed the crash was heavier than the impact itself. Caspian pushed against the crumpled canopy, the emergency releases hissing with a puff of white vapor. He tumbled out onto the soft, mossy floor of the forest, his lungs burning with the oversaturated oxygen of the alien world. The trees were massive, their trunks pulsing with a faint, rhythmic bioluminescence that looked like a heartbeat. He stood up, his flight suit torn at the shoulder, revealing the tanned, scarred skin of a man who had spent too much time in the fringes of the galaxy. He reached for his sidearm, but his holster was empty, lost somewhere in the wreckage. "Great," he said, wiping blood from his forehead. A rustle in the undergrowth made him freeze. It wasn't the sound of an animal, it was too melodic, like the chime of silver bells. Out of the violet mist emerged a woman who looked as though she had been woven from the light of a dying star. She was tall, her skin a soft, pearlescent hue that seemed to catch every stray beam of light. Her hair was a river of deep indigo, falling in waves past her waist. She wore garments that looked like liquid gold, clinging to a body that possessed curves that felt both dangerous and divine. She stopped 10 paces from him, her wide, golden eyes fixed on his face with a mixture of terror and wonder. "Are you a dream?" she asked, her voice a low, resonant hum that vibrated in his very marrow. Caspian took a step forward, his heavy boots sinking into the iridescent moss. He had seen many things in the Orion arm, but nothing that compared to the raw, breathtaking beauty of the creature standing before him. He held up his hands, palms open in the universal gesture of peace. "I'm just a pilot who had a very bad day," he replied, his voice raspy. She moved closer, her movements fluid and devoid of the jerky uncertainty of most sentient species. She reached out a hand, her fingers trembling as she touched the fabric of his flight suit. Her touch was electric, a jolt of heat that flared through his chest. He looked down at her, noting the intricate, glowing markings that traced the lines of her collarbone. She wasn't a goddess, he realized, but she was something far more complex than a mere biological organism. "No one comes here," she whispered, looking up at him with an intensity that made his breath catch. "I've always had a problem with following directions," he said, allowing a small, crooked smile to play on his lips. She tilted her head, her gaze drifting to the wreckage of his ship. The Vanguard 7 was a twisted heap of titanium and carbon fiber, its engines still ticking as they cooled. She looked back at him, her eyes searching his. "You are from the stars, but you are not like the ones who left me here," she noted, her hand moving from his shoulder to the rough stubble on his jaw. Caspian leaned into her touch, the scent of crushed lilies and warm rain clinging to her. He had been alone in the black of space for months, and the sudden, overwhelming proximity of another living being was like a physical blow. He reached up, his large, calloused hand covering hers against his face. "My name is Caspian," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "Vaylin," she replied, the name sounding like a song. She led him through the forest, the plants themselves seeming to pull back to create a path for her. They arrived at a structure that defied the logic of the local architecture. It was a spire of white stone and dark metal, overgrown with vines that pulsed with a soft blue light. This was her home, her temple, and her prison. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of ancient parchment and static. "Why are you here alone, Vaylin?" he asked, as he sat on a low stone bench. "I am the keeper," she said, turning to face him. "The keeper of what?" he questioned, watching the way the light danced across her shimmering skin. "The balance," she answered, dropping her gaze. Caspian watched her, his mind already racing with the technical challenges of his situation. He was a human, and humans were built to solve problems, to fix what was broken, and to push against the walls of the universe. He looked at her lonely, beautiful face and felt a surge of protectiveness that he couldn't quite explain. He wasn't just going to fix his ship. He was going to figure out why this woman was trapped in a forest that was supposed to be forbidden. "I'm going to get us out of here," he promised, the weight of the statement hanging in the air. Vaylin looked at him, a flicker of hope or perhaps fear crossing her features. She walked toward him, her liquid gold dress swishing against her thighs. She stopped between his knees, her presence a heavy, sweet weight. "Many have tried to enter this place," she said, resting her hands on his shoulders. "They weren't me," he replied, his hands settling on her narrow waist. The heat between them was sudden and absolute. Caspian pulled her closer, his head tilting back as she leaned down. Her hair fell around them like a curtain, isolating them in a world of gold and indigo. When her lips finally met his, it wasn't a soft greeting. It was a collision of two lonely souls, a desperate, hungry exchange that tasted of salt and longing. He groaned into her mouth, his fingers digging into the soft flesh of her hips. She was firm and soft all at once, a masterpiece of alien biology that responded to his touch with a fervor that matched his own. "You are so warm," she breathed, pulling back just enough to look into his dark eyes. "That's just the human engine running," he whispered, his thumb tracing the curve of her lower lip. He stood up, lifting her effortlessly. She wrapped her legs around his waist, her arms locking behind his neck. He carried her toward a dais covered in soft, woven furs, his mind a haze of desire and the primal need to claim what the universe had seen fit to throw in his path. The forest outside might be sentient, and the galaxy might be cold. But in this room, there was only the sound of their breathing and the friction of skin against skin. "Show me everything," she commanded, her voice thick with a need she hadn't known she possessed. Caspian didn't need to be told twice. He stripped away the remnants of his flight suit, his lean, muscled frame a stark contrast to her ethereal glow. He was a creature of earth and fire, and she was a creature of light and shadow. As he moved over her, the markings on her skin flared brighter, responding to the intensity of his touch. He explored every inch of her, his mouth finding the sensitive skin of her throat and the soft swell of her breasts. She arched beneath him, her fingers clawing at his back as he drove them both toward a precipice of sensation. "Caspian," she cried out, her voice echoing off the stone walls. He didn't stop until they were both spent, lying in a tangle of limbs and damp fur. The silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was comfortable, filled with the presence of another. Caspian watched the way the bioluminescence of the forest filtered through the high windows, casting long, blue shadows across Vaylin's sleeping form. He knew he had work to do. His ship was a wreck, and the goddess beside him was part of a machine he didn't yet understand. But as he ran a hand over his tired face, he knew one thing for certain. "I'm not leaving without her," he muttered to the empty room. The next morning, the reality of their situation set in. Caspian returned to the crash site, carrying a toolkit he had salvaged from a hidden compartment in the spire. Vaylin followed him, her golden eyes wide as she watched him work. He was deep in the bowels of the Vanguard 7, his hands covered in grease and hydraulic fluid. He was rerouting the power couplings, using a piece of reinforced hull plating to bypass a fried circuit breaker. It was a crude, brilliant bit of engineering that most alien races would have considered impossible given the lack of proper facilities. "What are you doing?" she asked, peering over his shoulder. "I'm teaching this heap of junk some manners," he replied, wiping sweat from his eyes with his forearm. "Your species," she started, "you do not wait for the tools you need. If we waited for everything to be perfect, we'd still be living in caves on Earth," he said, tightening a bolt with a grunt of effort. He looked at her, seeing the way she watched the sparks from his torch. She was fascinated by the way he manipulated the physical world. To her, things were either ordained by the creators or they simply were. The idea of a being who could take a broken thing and force it to work through sheer will was foreign to her. "Humans are stubborn, Vaylin," he continued. "We don't like being told no." "The forest says no to everyone," she whispered, looking up at the canopy. "The forest hasn't met a pilot with a deadline," he joked, though his eyes remained serious. As the days passed, Caspian's respect for the forest grew, but so did his understanding of it. It wasn't just a collection of plants, it was a sophisticated biological computer, and Vaylin was the processor. He spent his nights in the spire, buried in the ancient data consoles that she had never dared to touch. He discovered the twist that changed everything. The Forbidden Forest wasn't a holy site or a natural wonder. It was a massive, planetary-scale shield generator designed to protect the sector from a dormant, ancient threat. Vaylin wasn't a goddess protecting the balance. She was the living battery, her life force being drained slowly to keep the shields at standby. "Vaylin," he called out, his voice sharp with revelation. She appeared in the doorway, her indigo hair glowing in the dim light of the consoles. "What is it, Caspian?" she asked, sensing his agitation. "This place isn't a temple," he said, pointing to the scrolling lines of code on the screen. "It is my home," she insisted, though her voice wavered. "It's a cage," he corrected, walking toward her. "They told me I was chosen," she whispered, her eyes filling with a sudden, sharp clarity. "They lied," he said, taking her hands in his. "The ones who left me here. The High Council of the Hegemony," she stated, the realization washing over her like cold water. "They're using you as a biological capacitor," he explained, his anger simmering just below the surface. "Every time the shields pulse, it's taking a piece of you." He pulled her into his arms, feeling the slight tremor in her frame. He was a human, and if there was one thing humans hated more than a broken machine, it was a sentient being treated like one. The HFY spirit burned bright in him. He wasn't just going to fix his ship, he was going to rewire a planet. "I can fix this," he told her, his voice a low, steady promise. "How?" she asked, looking up at him. "I'm going to replace you," he said. "Replace me," she gasped, pulling back. "With my ship's fusion core," he clarified. "It's a high-output reactor. If I can bridge the gap between human technology and this biomess, I can give this forest all the power it needs without touching you." "That sounds difficult," she said, her brow furrowed. "It's what we do," he replied, a fierce glint in his eyes. The work was grueling. Caspian spent 48 hours straight without sleep, dragging components from the crash site to the spire's subterranean power hub. He was covered in grime, his hands cut and bruised, but his focus was absolute. He had to interface his ship's digital brain with the forest's analog biological nervous system. He used a series of improvised transducers, soldering wires to pulsing vines and bypass valves. Vaylin stayed by his side, feeding him water and watching with an awe that bordered on reverence. "You are a creature of chaos," she remarked, as he cursed at a stubborn connection. "I prefer the term resourceful," he grunted, as he finalizes a complex bypass. The physical strain was immense, but the mental challenge was even greater. He was translating two entirely different languages of existence. But he was a pilot, a man who lived and breathed system integration. He saw the patterns where others saw noise. "Almost there," he muttered, his eyes bloodshot. The romance between them intensified in the quiet moments between his bouts of labor. They didn't have much time, but the time they had was electric. In the middle of a power cell swap, he would pull her against him, his grease-stained hands leaving marks on her golden dress. They would find pockets of space in the spire to lose themselves in each other, a desperate, driving passion that served as a fuel for his work. She was no longer a distant goddess. She was a woman who had discovered her own desire, and she pursued it with a fierce, alien hunger. "If we fail," she said, one evening as they lay together on the floor of the power hub. "We won't," he interrupted, kissing the sensitive skin behind her ear. "The hegemony will come," she warned. "They will see the power signature change." "Let them come," he said, his voice hard. "I've got a galaxy's worth of human spite ready for them." The moment of truth arrived on the 7th day. Caspian stood before the main interface, his hand hovering over the activation switch of his makeshift reactor. The fusion core from the Vanguard 7 was hummed with a low, blue light, connected to the spire by a web of cables and vines. "Ready?" he asked, looking at Vaylin. She stood at the central pedestal, her hands resting on the ancient touch plates. She looked terrified but resolute. "Ready," she said. He flipped the switch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a roar of power surged through the spire. The walls vibrated, and the bioluminescence of the forest outside flared into a blinding, white radiance. Vaylin screamed as the connection to the forest was severed, the sudden loss of the parasitic link throwing her backward. Caspian caught her, his boots sliding on the stone floor as the spire groaned under the influx of energy. "Stay with me," he yelled over the noise. The lights flickered, then stabilized. The deep, rhythmic pulsing of the forest changed to a steady, vibrant hum. The fusion core was holding. The planetary shields were stronger than they had been in centuries, and they were no longer powered by a living soul. Vaylin opened her eyes, gasping for air. She looked down at her hands, then at her chest. The glowing markings on her skin had dimmed to a soft, natural shimmer. She looked lighter, as if a physical weight had been lifted from her shoulders. I can feel it," she whispered. "The forest is happy, but it's not taking from me." "Told you," Caspian said, his voice cracking with exhaustion. He collapsed against her, his strength finally failing. She held him, her arms strong and certain. "You did it," she said, tears of gold-flecked light tracking down her cheeks. "We did it," he corrected, closing his eyes. Their victory was short-lived. Just as Caspian had predicted, the hegemony was not pleased with the unauthorized modification of their planetary assets. 3 sleek silver cruisers appeared in the skies of Xylos, their landing craft descending like hawks upon the spire. "They're here," Vaylin said, her voice trembling as she looked out the window. Caspian stood up, his joints popping. He reached into his salvaged gear and pulled out a heavy-duty pulse rifle he had managed to repair. "Good," he said, checking the charge. "I was hoping for a chance to test this." The hegemony soldiers were tall, slender beings with cold, analytical eyes. They moved with a synchronized grace that spoke of millennia of genetic conditioning. They burst into the spire, their weapons drawn, led by an officer with a high, crested helmet. His name was Xylos, and he had spent his life maintaining the status quo of the Orion Arm. "By order of the High Council," Xylos announced, "you are in violation of Galactic Decree 404. "I missed that meeting," Caspian said, stepping in front of Vaylin. He held the pulse rifle with a casual ease that made the soldiers hesitate. There was something about the way he stood, the broad shoulders, the scarred hands, the absolute lack of fear, that didn't fit their calculations. "You have interfered with the divine balance," Xylos continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "The girl must be returned to the pedestal." "Not happening," Caspian said, his voice a low growl. "She's not a battery. She's a person, and this forest is doing just fine on a diet of human fusion." "You are a primitive," Xylos spat. "You do not understand the complexities of the Great Shield." "I understand that you were killing her," Caspian replied, "and I understand that my reactor is putting out 40% more power than she ever did. So if you want the shield to stay up, you're going to leave her alone." "The technology is incompatible," Xylos insisted. "Look at the readings," Caspian countered, gesturing to the consoles. "I didn't just plug it in. I adapted the core's output to match the forest's biorhythm. It's a hybrid system now, stronger, faster, human-made." Xylos looked at the screens, his eyes narrowing as he saw the data. The numbers didn't lie. The primitive had done in a week what their greatest engineers had claimed would take a century of research. "This is unexpected," Xylos admitted, his voice losing some of its edge. "Humans are full of surprises," Caspian said, not lowering his rifle. "Now, tell your men to back off, or I'll see how your armor stands up to an overcharged pulse shot." The tension in the room was a physical thing, a coiled spring ready to snap. Vaylin stepped forward, her hand resting on Caspian's arm. She looked at Xylos, her golden eyes burning with a new, fierce light. I am no longer your keeper, she said, her voice ringing through the spire. I am Vaylin, and I choose to go with the one who saw me, not the one who used me. Xylos looked from the woman to the pilot, then back to the humming fusion core. He was a creature of logic, and the logic was clear. The pilot had improved the system, and the girl was no longer essential. To fight would be to risk the shield and the lives of his men for a tradition that was now obsolete. Very well, Xylos said, signaling his men to lower their weapons. The council will be informed of this modification, but do not think you can hide from the galaxy, human. I'm not hiding, Caspian said, watching them retreat. I'm just getting started. When the soldiers were gone and the cruisers had vanished back into the black, Caspian and Vaylin stood on the balcony of the spire, looking out over the glowing forest. The Vanguard 7 was gone, but Caspian had managed to salvage enough parts to build a small, two-person shuttle from the hegemony's discarded landing gear. Where will we go? Vaylin asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. Wherever we want, Caspian replied, wrapping his arm around her. The galaxy is a big place, and I think it's about time they saw what a human and a goddess can do when they put their minds to it. He looked at her, his eyes full of a heat that had nothing to do with fusion cores. He turned her in his arms, his mouth seeking hers with a renewed passion. The forest pulsed beneath them, a silent witness to a change that would ripple across the stars. Humanity had arrived on Xylos as a crash, but they were leaving as a force that could redefine the very nature of the divine. You saved me, she whispered against his lips. No, he said, as he lifted her toward the shuttle. We saved each other. The stars were waiting, and for the first time in eons, the forbidden forest was silent, its ancient duty fulfilled by the ingenuity of a man who refused to believe in the impossible. They ascended into the black, a small spark of light against the velvet dark, carrying with them the secret of a power that was neither biological nor technological, but something far more potent, the human spirit and the love that could set a goddess free. As they cleared the atmosphere, Caspian checked the navigation arrays. He had set a course for the nearest human colony, a place where Vaylin could see what it was like to live among people who didn't bow to gods, but built them in their workshops. Is it always this beautiful? She asked, looking out at the swirling nebula of the sector. Only when you're looking at it with the right person, he said, his hand finding hers in the cockpit. She smiled, a brilliant, genuine expression that outshone the distant suns. Then let's go, she said. And they did, leaving behind the forbidden and flying toward a future that they would build together, one piece of stubborn, beautiful ingenuity at a time. The hegemony would watch them, the council would fear them, and the galaxy would never be the same again. Because when a human pilot crashes, he doesn't just survive. He rebuilds the world in his image, and he takes the goddess with him. The journey to the outer rim was long, but they didn't mind. The shuttle was cramped, filled with the smell of recycled air and the lingering scent of Vaylin's skin. Caspian taught her how to read the star charts, showing her the constellations of Earth, the hunter, the bear, the sisters. She, in turn, told him stories of the ancient ones who had planted the forest, the beings of light who had long since vanished into the great beyond. They were afraid of the dark, she said, as she watched the stars pass. We aren't, Caspian replied as he adjusted the throttle. We've spent too much time living in it to be afraid of it anymore. He pulled her into his lap, his hands exploring the familiar territory of her body. Every time they touched, it was like the first time, a shock of recognition and a desperate need to be closer. He was a man who had always been searching for something, and in this alien woman, he had found his North Star. Tell me about Earth, she whispered, her fingers tracing the scars on his chest. It's a noisy, messy, beautiful place, he said, his voice full of a nostalgia he hadn't realized he possessed. It's full of people who shouldn't be able to get along but somehow do. It's full of history and potential. You'll love the oceans. Oceans, she repeated, the word unfamiliar on her tongue. Endless water, he explained, stretching all the way to the horizon. She closed her eyes, imagining it, a world that wasn't a forest, a world that wasn't a cage. I want to see it all, she said. And you will, he promised, pressing a kiss to her brow. As the shuttle moved deeper into human space, they began to pick up the chatter of long-range comms. The voices were varied, speaking in a dozen different dialects, but the underlying tone was the same, busy, energetic, and undeniably human. "Who are they?" Vaylin asked, listening to the static-filled voices. "Those are the people who are going to welcome you home," Caspian said, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. He opened a channel, his hand steady on the transmitter. "This is Vanguard 7 Scout, requesting clearance for approach. I've got a passenger with me, and we're coming in hot." "Vanguard 7? We thought you were dust, Caspian." The voice on the other end crackled back, filled with a surprised warmth. "I got delayed," Caspian said, looking at Vaylin with a wink. "But I'm back, and I've brought a little bit of the forbidden with me." The landing at New Terra was a spectacle. News of Caspian's return and the mysterious woman by his side spread like wildfire. But as they stepped out of the shuttle and onto the landing pad, Caspian didn't see the cameras or the crowds. He only saw Vaylin, her face turned up to the sunlight of a different star, her eyes wide with the wonder of a universe that was finally hers to explore. "Welcome home," he whispered, taking her hand. She looked at him, her golden eyes shining with a light that was no longer a battery for a planet, but a fire for a life. "I am home," she said. And together, they walked into the crowd, a human pilot and his goddess, ready to show the galaxy that some things are meant to be broken so that something better can be built in their place. The HFY spirit wasn't just about ships and guns. It was about the audacity to love what shouldn't be loved and the ingenuity to make it possible. In the years that followed, Caspian and Vaylin became legends, not for the crash or the shield, but for the way they bridged the gap between species. They traveled the galaxy, fixing what was broken and teaching others that the only real forbidden things are the walls we build around ourselves. And every night, when the stars were high and the world was quiet, they would return to each other, finding in their embrace a peace that no goddess could ever provide and no pilot could ever find in the black. The forbidden forest on Xylos remained, its shields powered by a human fusion core that refused to quit. It stood as a monument to a pilot who had looked at a goddess and saw a woman, and a woman who had looked at a human and saw a savior. The galaxy was changing, and it was a change that had begun with a crash in a violet forest. "Are you happy, Vaylin?" Caspian asked, one evening as they sat on the deck of their new ship, the Star Chaser. She looked at him, her indigo hair fluttering in the artificial breeze of the life support. She leaned over and kissed him, a deep, lingering kiss that said more than words ever could. "I am free," she said, "and that is the same thing." He pulled her closer, the warmth of her body a constant comfort. He had fixed many things in his life, but this was his masterpiece. A life built on the wreckage of the old, powered by the fusion of two souls who refused to be anything less than extraordinary. "To the stars," he said, lifting his glass. "To the stars," she echoed. And they sailed on, into a future that was no longer forbidden, but wide open and brilliantly, beautifully human. The Orion arm would never be the same, and that was exactly how Caspian wanted it. He was a human, after all, and humans never did like things staying the same for too long. They were the architects of change, the engineers of the impossible, and the lovers of goddesses. And as long as there were stars in the sky and a ship under his feet, Caspian would be right there in the middle of it all, with Vaylin by his side. The final word on Xylos was written by Xylos, the hegemony officer who had seen the change firsthand. In his report to the High Council, he didn't speak of violations or primitives. He spoke of a power that the hegemony had forgotten, the power of individuals to rewrite their own destinies. "The human did not just fix the machine," Xylos wrote. "He transformed it. And in doing so, he transformed us. We should not fear the humans for their technology, but for their spirit. It is a force that even the stars cannot contain." And he was right. The forest was no longer forbidden. It was a beacon. A reminder that even in the deepest, darkest thicket, there is light. And sometimes, it takes a human pilot with a broken ship and a stubborn heart to find it. "I love you, Caspian," Vaylin said, as they watched the sun set over New Terra. "I know," he said, with a grin that was all human. "I love you too." The story of the pilot and the goddess became a song, a legend, and a truth. It was a story of humanity at its best, brave, brilliant, and hopelessly romantic. And as the star chaser disappeared into the jump gate, the last thing the galaxy saw was a spark of light, heading toward a horizon that was no longer a boundary, but a beginning.